Hello everybody, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Welcome to today's Critical Thought. We are returning to a topic that I love talking about, and that is the two sides of progression in game design. Before we get to that, I have a really good topic that I want to talk about, something that is near and dear to my heart. But unfortunately, this weekend we are recording, it is PAX West, so unfortunately I'm going to have to wait until Monday, and where there's a greater chance people will be able to watch this and be aware of it. But let's get talking about today's topic. Progression in game design is actually part of my very first article I wrote called The Abstraction of Skill. And for every video game ever made, regardless of platform, genre, developer, there are two ways that progression is tracked in the games. The first one is going to be action or player-based. Player-based progression refers to the player themselves learning and essentially improving their own way of playing the game. This is commonly seen in action games where players figure out the best combos to use or have the hand-eye coordination to quickly perform actions and maneuvers. We can even extend this into learning proper hotkey usage and controlling your units in a game like StarCraft. And so many action games are examples. God Hand, Ninja Gaiden Black, Devil May Cry, even platformers like Super Meat Boy and Super Mario that test the player on how well they can react to what's being thrown at them. On the other side of the spectrum, we have abstraction or in-game progression. Abstraction progression essentially is things improving or changing in-game that affect how the game is played. Some examples would be any turn-based RPG and how your character stats will determine whether they hit, miss, crit, etc. We can extend this into strategy games like Civilization, with the abstraction of how to properly build your city, or how unit combat is determined. Essentially, any time the computer or the game has to make an internal calculation, that is abstraction at work. And for the longest time, these two extremes were kept separate. You had your games like Mario, you had your games like Final Fantasy, and never the two shall meet. And that's how things were from most of the 80s into 90s. Then, starting from last decade, something happened. We started to see developers experiment with adding elements from the opposite side into their games. This is where the idea of action RPGs started to become really popular, where the player is controlling their unit in real time, but there's still this RPG layer at work. We could even see this with games like Call of Duty, with adding an entire RPG progression mechanic behind their multiplayer layer. And you would think, now you think that's pretty common. It seems every first-person shooter is doing it these days. But that wasn't the case back then. And when it works, combining these two polarizing schools of progression can really elevate a game and take it into places we never thought were possible. And one of the more interesting challenges, and this is a core tenet for game developers, is understanding what your audience is based on your progression. People who prefer action or player-based progression, they want to know that they are in complete control. They want the game to live or die based on their own actions. If there is an RPG layer that says, oh, you're 5 levels below this enemy, you can't hurt him, they're going to be pissed off. They don't want to spend time doing like min-maxing or a lot of stuff that's not about the direct gameplay. On the opposite end, players who prefer abstraction or in-game progression, they rather play a game that's more about planning. That's about them figuring out the best moves, the best tactics, and then building their strategy around that. They don't want to be pressured to making high-speed actions or, their hand-eye coordination determining whether or not they win or lose. And the important thing to understand is that neither one of these is considered superior. There are as many action fans as there are RPG fans. But the important part, and this is incredibly powerful for game developers watching this, is what this means when you start getting into the middle. When you start adding action elements to RPGs or RPG layers to action games. As I said, when it works, it can elevate a game dramatically. But whenever you start taking elements from the other side, it starts to make it a little bit harder to attract your core audience. And I have two very big examples of this, and how once you get into the middle, things start to get a little muddled. The first one is Borderlands. Obviously, we know Borderlands is what's called a role-playing shooter. How it works is you control this game as you would a normal first-person shooter. You move, you shoot, jump, dodge, all that stuff. There's no calculations, there's no dice roll to determine whether you're going to shoot an enemy or you're going to miss. If your cursor's on the enemy, you're going to hit. If it's not, you're going to miss. The millisecond you hit an enemy, the abstraction comes into play. The game will determine the difference in levels, how much damage your weapon can do, what's the enemy's defense, was there any elemental or special damage, and where you hit them. And all that is calculated within a millisecond to give you a damage readout. Now, while you are still in control and determine whether you're going to win or lose, the game's RPG layers, on the other hand, will affect how things are going to play out. If I'm 5 levels below an enemy, I will intrinsically do less damage compared to that enemy hitting me, and vice versa if I'm 5 levels above. What that means is that there is an RPG layer that is essentially in control of how you play Borderlands. Now, the opposite side, but still close to the middle, we can see this with the recent Fallout games and the Elder Scrolls series, such as Skyrim and Oblivion. If you look in the if you look in the upper left-hand corner, that is the special character sheet or character builder from Fallout 3. In the Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, you play the game as you would a normal first-person shooter. You move around in real time, you can move, you can jump, you can crouch, you can do all that stuff. But the second you try to do any kind of interaction with the world around you, the RPG layer comes in. It's no longer about me just aiming my gun and shooting an enemy. I'm going to shoot the enemy, and then my perception is going to have an effect of whether or not I'm going to hit. When I hit the enemy, my skill with weapons will determine how much damage I do. The enemy's own defenses will determine whether or not that hit will actually do massive damage. Even if I shoot an enemy in the head, while there is a greater chance for critical hits, it's not guaranteed as it was in Borderlands. And everything else that I do is revolving around this kind of abstraction. Even if I am the master at lockpicking, I know it's the wrong game, but keep with it, keep with the analogy. I can't lockpick certain things unless my own lockpicking stat is high enough. Likewise, it doesn't matter if I'm good at platforming or if I'm good at moving around, if my stealth skills or whatnot are in flavor or in the right kind of stats. Likewise, doesn't matter how good I am at using a gun, if I don't have the right perks to use said weapons, I'll suffer a penalty. You can take this to its extreme in the game Vampire the Masquerade, I think it was Bloodlines. I think that was the second one. In that game, the dice roll that determines how much damage you do is all affected by your stat in a given weapon, or in a specific field. So that means if I'm using a double-barreled shotgun, and I hit an enemy point blank in the face, if I'm only like a 1 in terms of using a shotgun-based weapon, I'm going to barely do any damage. But if I have a 10 in unarmed combat, my fist will be like martial arts times 10. I'll kick everyone's ass that way. But, as you can guess, what I do as a player doesn't really matter. Doesn't matter how well I'm clicking if my stats are too low. And this is one of the things that makes it very tricky to have these kinds of systems together. What we see where games do work is when it still is predominantly one flavor, but there are elements that help to elevate it from the other end. The Soul series is a perfect example of this. Anyone can tell you that there is abstraction in a Dark Souls game. What your soul level is, what your stats are. That determines how much damage your weapons do, what gear you can wear, what spells you can use. But anyone who plays a Souls game knows that all that stuff is secondary to your own mastery of that game. If you don't know the timings for blocking or correct use of your weapons, it doesn't matter if you're soul level 100, you're going to get your ass kicked by most enemies. On the other end, we see some RPGs delving into button press or time mechanics. Super Mario RPG and the Paper Mario games are examples of this. They are RPGs, you have stats and leveling. But if you time your button presses correctly, your weapons will do more damage, you'll take less damage, maybe even special abilities will proc when you're using your special attacks. And again, this is still predominantly an RPG. It's 90% RPG. But that just 10% of player-based progression just adds another layer to this game. And we are approaching about 12 minutes, so we'll wrap up today's critical thought. But again, understanding what your progression layer is for your game is very vital if you're going to become a game developer. If I'm building a platformer, I know any kind of RPG mechanics have to be kept to a minimum to none at all. Likewise, if I'm building a hardcore dungeon crawling roguelike RPG, having, 10-hit combo, button combo combinations and requiring my player to properly dodge may not be that well received from that crowd. If you can balance it, however, and you can get those two to work properly, you can create some very imaginative games that have never been seen before. And to end this critical thought, I'm going to say something very shocking. I am not a fan of the Elder Scrolls and the recent Fallout games. This goes back to my kind of preference. I am an action mechanic kind of player. I want to know that I'm in complete control. So when RPG abstraction kind of affects whether or not I'm effective, it just really rubs me the wrong way, and I just don't enjoy those games that much. It's one of the reasons why a lot of MMOs just have not managed to hook me. I really enjoyed DC Universe, there we go, which had a lot of button combo presses and you could actually actively dodge attacks. That kind of thing makes me more engaged and makes me realize that I am essentially the master of my own fate. But, as you know, I play a lot of RPGs as well. Right now I'm playing Disgaea, which is the ultimate in abstraction-based progression. But, as I said, I usually like the games that are either on both extremes or borrow slightly from their respective opposites. The middle of the road, this kind of center of combining, is usually a tough sell for me. So to end this critical thought, I'm going to ask you, do you prefer games that are predominantly action-based? Do you prefer RPG? Or do you prefer that creamy middle of intersecting mechanics and design? There is no right answer to this. Again, we all have our own preferences and our own flavors. But as developers, you need to understand what is the progression you're aiming for and how that's going to be applied through the game. But that's going to do it for today's critical thought. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed it, of course, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. Your donations can help to not only keep things going, but we can add more great content and coverage through Patreon donations. Anyway, that's been today's critical thought. Once again, I'm Josh Bycer, and I will see you all tomorrow with another one. Take care. Thanks for watching the video, everybody. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment, of course, share with your friends. It always helps out. Check out game-wisdom.com, where I examine the art and science of games. You can follow me on Twitch and Twitter under GW Bycer for the latest updates of new content. And be sure to check out our Patreon campaign. You can find us on Patreon under Game Wisdom. if you would like to donate and help contribute to keeping Game Wisdom going. Your donations can not only give us the monthly funding we need to keep supporting ourselves, but if we can hit some goals, it will mean more great content for you, and there are some nifty little rewards there as well. Thanks for watching this video, and be sure to tune into the next one real soon.